Nick Walker is one of the top bodybuilders in the world, but he is missing one thing: aesthetics. And with the current competition, he is doomed to always fall short. Historically, the Mr. Olympia winners have generally always had an aesthetic shape, except for the late 90s and 2000s when the era of Ronnie vs. Jay was in. In this era, the mass monster look was preferred by the judges. But looking back at the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the majority of winners were all tall and aesthetic. The 70s. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the Mr. Olympia winner from 1970 to 1975. He is the pioneer of bodybuilding, the man who the sport was built around, and he was 6 foot tall, had a very small waist, and a very aesthetic X-frame look. Fast forward to the 80s, where Lee Haney dominated the decade and into the early 1990s, winning 8 Olympia titles in a row. Very similar to Arnold, Lee was 5'11", had a very small waist to also give him the aesthetic X-frame look. The 90s is where things slowly started to change. Dorian Yates took over in 1992, going on to win 6 Olympias in a row. He was 5'10", and in the early stages of his career, he had a somewhat aesthetic look, but would grow into a mass monster to start the era of bodybuilding, but the goal was to be as big as humanly possible. This would go on to set things up for the Ronnie Coleman versus Jay Cutler saga, where it would become the battle of who could put on the most size. Ronnie and Jay brought some of the biggest packages ever to the Olympia stage. This era was when aesthetics took a backseat to the freak factor. Waists were blown out, GH gut was everywhere, but nobody cared. They just wanted to see the biggest, freakiest person on stage, and the judges rewarded them for it. And a lot of guys with aesthetic physiques like Flex Wheeler, Chris Cormier, Dexter Jackson were also in this era too, but neither of them could come close to beating either Jay or Ronnie because mass was in and they did not have the mass, but only an aesthetic physique. This era lasted up until Jay and Ronnie's careers would come to an end and Phil Heath would take over. Phil would go on to win 7 consecutive Olympias from 2011 to 2017. Phil had arguably one of the greatest physiques of all time. He had very good shape, extremely round muscle bellies to give him the 3D look, and incredible posing. Phil's Olympia run would change the narrative from mass monster back to aesthetics, what the sport was originally built on. After Phil came Sean Roden and Brandon Curry, both very aesthetic with good shape. But then things started to take a turn back to the mass era, with Big Ramy winning 2 Olympias back-to-back, followed up by Hadi Choopan winning in 2023. Both Ramy and Hadi do not have the best shape, with Big Ramy being known for his mass and his large quads, and Hadi being known for his extreme conditioning and also his blocky shape. As you can see, it kind of seemed like the narrative was shifting away from the aesthetic look and back to the wow factors of mass and crazy conditioning. This would have been the perfect narrative for Nick Walker to go into his prime with, but the IFBB do not want this narrative to come back, and this is why. Let's face it, the IFBB want to make money. In 2022, their total revenue was around $8.5 million, which really isn't much in comparison to other major sports. So to grow that revenue, they need to also grow their fan base. And your average fan who is not a die-hard bodybuilding fan will not be attracted to the mass monster, blocky look. They will veer towards the more aesthetic, taller shape. It's just the laws of human nature. People will naturally gravitate to a certain look more often than others. Take Chris Bumstead for example. He is the most popular bodybuilder in the public eye right now with 16 million followers on Instagram. Every 20-year-old wants to look and be like Chris. The classic physique division has never been so popular, and this is solely because of Chris Bumstead. If Chris had a physique like Nick Walker, he would not be who he is today. The fan base would have not gravitated to him because the majority of the population does not want to look like a blocky mass monster. They want to be aesthetic. And obviously, Chris brings more to the table than just his look. He does have a great personality, but so does Nick Walker, so it's kind of comparable. So what I'm gathering from all of this is that the IFBB want an aesthetic look to take the forefront of the open division because that is what's going to grow the fan base and what will in turn make them more money. And the thing is, the IFBB can put anybody at the forefront of the open division because of the judging system. They judge shows based on a competitor's muscle size, definition, and separation, as well as their overall conditioning and balance between muscle groups. But judges can score competitors according to the total package and only on total package. For example, if you take 2 competitors through the mandatory poses side by side, and the shorter, blockier mass monster was to win 6 out of 8 poses, he could still lose the show because the judges thought the other more aesthetic looking guy was a better overall package. It's a very opinionated, subjective sport, and the judges do not need to give any other detail as to why one person won over another than they just personally preferred physique A over physique B. So it was extremely easy for the IFBB to control the narrative of who and what look they want at the forefront of the sport. After seeing the 2023 Arnold Classic, I think it is very clear that the IFBB want to change the current narrative. Samson Dauda has a far superior shape than Nick Walker, tall with a small waist, giving a very impressive X frame, as compared to Nick being short, blocky, with freakish arms and overall size. In the show, pose by pose, Nick beat Samson for a majority win, as well as in conditioning, but since the shows are heavily judged based on shape and overall package, Samson still won, and anyone with a more aesthetic look will always beat out Nick, unless they come into the show completely off. With the caliber of guys right now competing in the IFBB with aesthetic looks, it does not look good for Nick. Right now there's Samson Dauda, Derek Lunsford, and Andrew Jack, just to name a few. They all have far better shapes than Nick, and even though he may beat out one or two of them, there's no way he will beat them all. The judges will always refer back to the overall package and will favor the more aesthetic guy, never giving Nick Walker an Olympia win. Nick is essentially the new Branch Warren. He will outwork everybody, bring crazy conditioning and size, but his shape will forever hold him back. And at best, I think Nick will only get second at the Olympia. The days of mass in the IFBB are long gone. Aesthetics are in, and I think they're here to stay. It's in the best interest of the IFBB to continue this narrative, and they have all the power to do it. What the IFBB wants, the IFBB will always get. And as for Nick Walker, he does not fit into their narrative, and the IFBB will never reward him with an Olympia title. The only way this will happen is if the judging criteria changes, which has not changed in over 50 years. They will be giving away their power and control, a thing that nobody ever wants to lose.